Ladies and gentlemen, today's headlines may feel like thunderclaps in a storm we've long seen forming. The Ukraine-Russia war has escalated once again. But before we get swept away by breaking news, flashes, and dramatic sound bites, we need to pause and ask what is really driving this conflict and who benefits when it continues to burn. As an economist, I want to remind you that wars rarely erupt in a vacuum. Behind every troop movement and every urgent headline lies an economic story, one that is too often hidden beneath the smoke of battle. The escalation we witness today is not only a clash of armies, it is the predictable outcome of decades of global economic tension. For years, the global economy has been under strain. The end of the Cold War promised a peace dividend, but instead we saw the unrestrained expansion of global capitalism, wealth concentrated at the top while working people, whether in Moscow, Kiev, Berlin, or New York, faced stagnant wages and rising inequality. Economic insecurity breeds political instability, and instability makes fertile ground for conflict. Russia's leadership, facing its own domestic economic pressures, has long sought to reassert geopolitical influence. Ukraine, striving toward the European Union and Western markets, became both a symbol and a strategic chessboard. The United States and NATO, meanwhile, have their own economic and military interests, arms industries, energy markets, and global influence. None of these forces are innocent bystanders. They are economic actors, and war, tragic as it is, can also be immensely profitable for certain sectors. Consider the energy markets. Every escalation sends oil and gas prices higher, enriching a few powerful corporations. Defense contractors in Washington and Moscow alike see their stocks rise with every new shipment of weapons. Meanwhile, the ordinary people of Ukraine and Russia and working families around the world bear the cost in lost lives, destroyed infrastructure, and inflation at the grocery store. And so we must ask, is this war purely about territory and sovereignty, or is it also a grim theater where economic empires compete for dominance? When we look at history from World War I to Iraq, the pattern is familiar. Wars justified in the name of security often conceal the deeper economic motives of those who stand to gain. The latest developments on the ground in Ukraine have shaken observers across the globe, raising alarms that this war has entered a far more volatile and unpredictable chapter. What was once a tense standoff has now erupted into a series of rapid escalations, sudden troop movements, intensified artillery barrages, and fresh reports of cross-border skirmishes that defy the fragile lines of previous ceasefire talks. Intelligence sources, both Western and regional, are describing this as the most significant surge in hostilities since the early days of the invasion. And the speed of these shifts has left even seasoned analysts scrambling for clarity. Eyewitnesses speak of columns of military hardware pushing toward contested zones overnight, while satellite imagery shows new fortifications being constructed at an almost feverish pace. Each move seems designed to outpace not just the opposing side, but also the world's ability to interpret what might happen next. What makes this moment so electrifying and so dangerous is the calculated ambiguity behind every action. Neither side is fully revealing its strategic intent, leaving room for speculation and miscalculation. Ukrainian forces, emboldened by a steady stream of Western intelligence and military assistance, appear to be probing weak points in Russian defenses, testing how far they can push before provoking a larger counteroffensive. At the same time, Russian units are reportedly repositioning heavy weaponry closer to key infrastructure nodes, signaling either a deterrent posture or preparations for a broader strike. Each maneuver is a message, but the meaning is left deliberately murky, and in that uncertainty lies the risk of escalation that no one can fully control. Adding to the volatility are the political calculations playing out in the capitals of the world's major powers. In Kiev, leaders frame every advance as a necessary step toward reclaiming sovereignty and securing the nation's survival. In Moscow, officials project defiance, insisting that any Ukrainian push will be met with a response powerful enough to shift the balance of the entire conflict. NATO members, meanwhile, face mounting domestic pressures, voters wary of endless military spending, energy markets rattled by every new report from the front, and allies urging unity in the face of what they call an existential challenge to European security. The result is a high-stakes geopolitical chess match in which each player is aware that a single misstep could unleash consequences far beyond the immediate battlefield. The tension is not confined to military maneuvers alone. It reverberates through global markets and everyday life. Energy prices have already begun to spike with each new round of artillery fire, and investors watch nervously as supply chains strain under the possibility of expanded sanctions or sudden infrastructure sabotage. Grain shipments from the region, vital to food security across parts of Africa and the Middle East, hang in the balance once again. The human cost is equally stark. Families in frontline towns rush to evacuation centers as air raid sirens pierce the night, while international aid agencies warn that humanitarian corridors could be severed if fighting continues at this intensity. For those who believe the war might be settling into a grim but predictable stalemate, these developments are a jarring reminder that conflict rarely stands still. Each hour brings fresh reports of skirmishes, each day a new twist that can open diplomatic calculations. The sense of urgency is palpable. This is no longer a distant conflict, but a live, unfolding crisis with the potential to reshape alliances, redraw borders, and jolt the global economy. Observers across newsrooms and policy circles agree on one thing: what happens in the coming days will not only determine the next phase of the Ukraine-Russia confrontation, but could also redefine the balance of power in Europe for years to come. Beyond the sound of missiles and the images of devastated cities lies another battlefield that is less visible but no less, decisive of the world of money and markets. The Ukraine-Russia war, now in an intensified phase, has become a proving ground for global economic interests. From energy giants to arms manufacturers, the conflict has triggered a cascade of financial opportunities and risks that reveal how closely war and profit are intertwined. Every escalation sends a jolt through oil and gas prices, and that shock travels instantly to stock exchanges in New York, London, and Shanghai. Traders who once watched quarterly earnings now hang on every battlefield report, knowing that a single artillery strike or disrupted pipeline can shift billions of dollars in minutes. This is not a side effect of war. It is part of the very engine that keeps it running. The most striking example is the energy market. Russia, one of the world's top exporters of oil and natural gas, has seen its resources turn into both a weapon and a lifeline. When sanctions attempt to choke off revenues, Moscow counters by tightening supply or redirecting exports toward countries willing to pay a premium. The mere hint of these moves sends global prices soaring. European nations, desperate to keep lights on and factories running, scramble for alternatives, buying liquefied natural gas from the United States, tapping reserves, and outbidding one another in a frantic global marketplace. For energy companies across the West and beyond, the war has become a windfall. Record profits reported quarter after quarter, dividends swelling even as consumers face crushing heating bills. Each headline of fresh fighting, each new sanction announcement acts like fuel for these profits, creating a grim dynamic where economic gain is tied to human suffering. Arms manufacturers find themselves in a similarly lucrative position. Major defense contractors in Washington, Berlin, Paris, and London are seeing demand that would have been unimaginable just a few years ago. Every package of military aid to Ukraine translates into new orders for artillery, shells, drones, and advanced missile systems. Stock prices of these corporations surge whenever new escalations are reported, and shareholders quietly celebrate even as diplomats issue calls for restraint. Russia's own defense industry, too, benefits from the imperative to replenish and modernize its forces, while countries on both sides of the geopolitical divide line up to upgrade their arsenals. War for these companies is not merely a crisis, it is a business model. Global markets beyond energy and defense are caught in the storm as well. Agricultural commodities, especially wheat and corn, have been rocked by disruptions in Ukrainian exports, driving prices higher and creating ripple effects from Cairo to Jakarta. Hedge funds and speculators capitalize on these swings, betting on shortages and turning volatility into opportunity. Meanwhile, ordinary people from Kansas to Kenya face rising grocery bills, their household budgets squeezed by forces they cannot see and certainly cannot control. Inflation, already a global concern, finds new momentum in every escalation of the conflict, eroding savings and heightening social unrest far from the front lines. What makes this economic dimension so unsettling is the way it creates powerful incentives to sustain rather than resolve the conflict. When the profits of energy conglomerates and defense contractors climb with each burst of artillery fire, when speculative trading thrives on uncertainty, and when governments see political leverage in controlling vital resources, the war acquires an economic momentum of its own. It is no longer just a contest of armies and ideologies. It becomes a marketplace of conflict where every headline is both tragedy and transaction. In this sense, the Ukraine-Russia war is not only reshaping the map of Europe, it is exposing the hidden mechanisms of global capitalism itself, revealing how closely the fate of millions can be tied to the balance sheets of a powerful few. Across the world's major capitals, the atmosphere is thick with unease as NATO, the United States, and their allies weigh their next steps in a conflict that is testing the limits of 21st century geopolitics. The latest escalation between Ukraine and Russia has not only sharpened military tensions on the ground, it has also set off a high-stakes diplomatic chess game where every move carries the possibility of reshaping global power balances. From Washington to Brussels, from Moscow to Beijing, the choices made in the coming weeks will echo far beyond Eastern Europe, rippling through economies, alliances, and strategic doctrines that have stood since the end of the Cold War. The question haunting policymakers is not simply how to end this war, but how to navigate a confrontation that could redraw the very architecture of global influence. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels, the mood is one of calculated urgency. Defense ministers meet behind closed doors to debate how far the alliance can go in supplying Ukraine with advanced weaponry without crossing the line into direct confrontation with Russia. Each shipment of long-range missiles or sophisticated air defense systems sends a dual message, a show of solidarity with Kiev and a warning to Moscow that aggression will not be tolerated. Yet, every act of support carries its own risk of retaliation, and NATO leaders are acutely aware that a misjudgment could ignite a spiral difficult to contain. Public statements project unity and resolve, but beneath the surface, member states juggle competing domestic pressures, rising energy costs, wary electorates, and the shadow of potential escalation. In Washington, these debates take on an added layer of complexity. The United States has emerged as the central supplier of military and financial assistance, but it also carries the burden of global leadership in an era when many question the durability of American power. Lawmakers spar over the scale and duration of aid, while strategists warn that any sign of wavering could embolden adversaries not only in Moscow, but also in Beijing or Tehran. At the same time, the Pentagon closely monitors Russian movements, calibrating every deployment of NATO forces to avoid unintended signals of aggression. It is a delicate dance of deterrence and diplomacy, one that requires precision and nerves of steel. Moscow, for its part, interprets each Western move through the lens of encirclement. Kremlin officials frame NATO's support for Ukraine as evidence of a long-running Western strategy to weaken Russia and deny it a sphere of influence. This narrative fuels domestic nationalism and justifies further mobilization while sending a clear message to countries in Russia's orbit. The Kremlin will not retreat quietly. Russian military planners step up exercises near NATO borders, dispatching bombers and warships in maneuvers meant to remind the West that Russia still wields formidable power. The ambiguity of Moscow's intentions keeps adversaries guessing, and that uncertainty is itself a weapon. Beyond these main players, other powers watch closely and position themselves for advantage. In Beijing, policymakers see both peril and opportunity. China publicly calls for dialogue and restraint, yet it also observes how Western sanctions reshape energy flows and financial networks, developments that could strengthen China's own economic leverage. Middle Eastern energy exporters, meanwhile, enjoy windfall profits as European nations scramble for alternatives to Russian gas, subtly shifting the balance of global energy politics. Each actor, whether ally or rival, views the conflict not only as a crisis, but also as a stage on which to recalibrate its role in the international order. The stakes are unmistakable. Every diplomatic signal, every military shipment, every sanction has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. The Ukraine-Russia war has become a crucible for the competing visions of global power, Western liberal alliances on one side, emerging multipolar ambitions on the other. What unfolds now will not merely determine the future of Ukraine. It will shape the strategic landscape for decades, testing whether the institutions built after World War II can withstand the pressures of a rapidly changing world. The drumbeat of escalating violence in Ukraine has triggered a rising chorus of urgent appeals for global action, a call that grows louder with every new barrage of artillery and every fresh report of civilian displacement. The stakes are immense. This is not merely a regional conflict, but a crisis whose shockwaves already reach across continents, threatening to unravel fragile economies, intensify food and energy insecurity, and challenge the credibility of the world's most important international institutions. For diplomats and policymakers, the question is no longer whether to respond, but how to act swiftly and decisively before the conflict spills into an even broader catastrophe. From the United Nations headquarters in New York to the meeting rooms of the European Union in Brussels, discussions have shifted from cautious observation to a sense of pressing responsibility. Envoys who once favored careful, incremental diplomacy now warn that the window for meaningful intervention is narrowing. Humanitarian agencies highlight the daily toll, families uprooted, hospitals under strain, and a generation of children growing up under the shadow of relentless shelling. Aid convoys face mounting danger as battle lines shift, and winter looms as a merciless force that will multiply the suffering of those trapped in besieged areas. Each passing day without a coordinated response deepens the human cost and fuels instability well beyond the war zone. Global leaders recognize that the repercussions are not confined to Eastern Europe. In Africa and the Middle East, nations already struggling with drought and economic fragility are watching food prices spike as Ukrainian grain exports remain uncertain. In Asia, energy-dependent economies brace for volatile fuel markets and rising inflation, the result of disrupted Russian gas and oil supplies. Even in wealthy countries, consumers feel the strain through higher living costs and market volatility. The war has laid bare the intricate web of global interdependence, reminding even the most distant nations that conflict in one corner of the world can ignite economic and political tremors everywhere. Efforts to contain the crisis are taking many forms, from emergency summits to high-stakes back-channel negotiations. The United States and European powers weigh new layers of sanctions designed to pressure Moscow, while also debating how to sustain military support for Ukraine without provoking a wider war. Middle powers such as Turkey, India, and Brazil position themselves as potential mediators, seeking both to prevent further bloodshed and to elevate their own influence in the shifting global order. China plays a careful game, issuing public calls for peace while quietly calculating how the conflict's outcome might alter the balance of power between Washington and Beijing. Each diplomatic move is both a gesture toward peace and a strategic calculation. What makes this moment especially volatile is the mounting fear that the conflict could spill across borders or spiral into an unpredictable confrontation between nuclear armed powers. NATO leaders openly warn of the dangers of miscalculation, while military analysts track every sign of escalation with unease. The threat of a regional war, one that could engulf not only Ukraine, but also neighboring states and potentially draw in major powers, gives a new urgency to calls for dialogue. Yet the same geopolitical rivalries that make a resolution urgent also make it elusive. Trust between Moscow and Western capitals is at its lowest in decades, and domestic politics in many countries reward defiance more than compromise. In the face of these tensions, voices from civil society, international NGOs, and grassroots movements insist that global action cannot wait for perfect political alignment. They argue that coordinated humanitarian aid, sustained diplomatic pressure, and innovative peace frameworks must be pursued simultaneously, even when the path forward seems uncertain. The world has entered a dangerous chapter where delay is itself a decision, and in that delay, the costs, human, economic, and strategic, continue to climb. The call for global action is not simply a plea for compassion. It is a recognition that the consequences of inaction will be measured not only in the lives lost today, but in the instability that could define the next generation.